Have you ever wondered how a small, rainy island in the North Atlantic became the largest empire the world has ever known? It's a story that doesn't start in a king's grand palace or on a bloody battlefield. Starts with the smell of salt and tar in the noisy, crowded streets of Britain's coastal towns. This is the story of how ambition, courage, and a relentless drive to look beyond the horizon forged an empire. Our journey begins in the 16th and 17th centuries. Forget the image of noble lords in powdered wigs for a moment. Instead, picture the common men, the shipwrights. Their hands calloused from shaping the very timbers that would carry Britain's dreams across the oceans. Picture the merchants, their minds buzzing with calculations of risk and reward, haggling over prices in bustling port cities like London, Bristol, and Plymouth. These weren't just cities. They were incubators of enterprise, crucibles where the fire of a nation's ambition was kindled. What was this ambition? At first, it wasn't about conquering the world. It was simpler, more human. It was about trade. It was about securing a better life, seeking fortune, and satisfying a deep-seated curiosity about what lay beyond the familiar gray waters of the English Channel. Young sailors, some barely men, would sign up for voyages into the complete unknown. They were fueled by tales of exotic lands, of spices worth more than gold, of silks so fine they seemed woven from moonlight. These early voyages were anything but a walk in the park. They were a lottery with life and death. A single Atlantic storm could splinter a ship into 1,000 pieces, sending its crew to a watery grave. Unknown coastlines hid treacherous reefs, and new lands held dangers they couldn't even imagine. Disease was a constant, silent companion on board. Many ships that sailed out with hopeful hearts never returned. But for every ship that was lost, another came back. And with it, they brought more than just spices and precious metals. They brought back knowledge. They brought back maps, charting coastlines that were previously just blank spaces on the parchment. They brought back stories of immense wealth, of strange cultures, and of a world so much bigger and more complex than anyone on their small island had ever conceived. These stories were like sparks, igniting the imagination of the entire nation and feeding its growing hunger for exploration and influence. This hunger wasn't just about getting rich. As the cogs of commerce turned faster and faster, a parallel ambition began to grow: naval power. The leaders of Britain, from the monarch down to the wealthy investors, understood a fundamental truth. To control trade, you had to control the seas. Shipbuilding transformed from a simple craft into a sophisticated industry, an art form that blended commerce and warfare. The ships they built became bigger, faster, and stronger. They were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons. Every new mast raised, every new sail hoisted, wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a statement. It was a declaration to rival powers like Spain and Portugal that Britain was no longer content to be a minor player. It was a small island nation asserting its presence, demanding its voice be heard in the chorus of emerging global powers. This wasn't just about building an economy. It was about building a destiny. As Britain's ships sailed farther, the nation had to learn new skills. It wasn't enough to just show up and trade. They had to be organized, resilient, and politically savvy. This is where we see the birth of the great trading companies, like the East India Company. These weren't just businesses. They were quasi-governmental organizations. They had their own armies, their own administrative structures, and their own diplomatic corps. They were the engines that would power the expansion, laying the financial and logistical groundwork for what would become a globe-spanning empire. These companies and the sailors they employed learned to navigate not just the treacherous oceans, but the even more treacherous waters of international politics. They forged alliances, engaged in diplomacy, and, when necessary, fought skirmishes with their rivals. Every negotiation, every treaty, every small naval clash was a lesson, honing the skills that would allow Britain to outmaneuver its competitors on the world stage for centuries to come. So, the seeds of empire were sown not in a single grand act of conquest, but in 1,000 small acts of courage, innovation, and relentless drive. It was in the sweat of the shipwright, the bravery of the sailor staring into a storm, and the bold vision of the merchant risking everything on a single voyage. It was a potent mix of individual ambition and national strategy, of commercial greed and a genuine thirst for discovery. The rise of the British Empire wasn't inevitable. It was built, plank by plank, decision by decision, by people who dared to look at their horizon and see not a boundary, but a gateway. The storms they weathered and the challenges they overcame weren't just obstacles. They were the very forces that shaped their character, forging a nation tough enough and ambitious enough to leave its mark on every continent on Earth. This was the dawn of ambition, the first light of a new era, illuminating a path that would lead a small island kingdom to the very forefront of the world stage. This incredible story is just beginning. The foundation has been laid, but the structure of the empire is yet to be built. In the centuries that followed, this maritime ambition would propel Britain into conflicts, discoveries, and controversies that would define the modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you next time. Have you ever wondered how a small island nation managed to build an empire that stretched across the entire globe? It's a story of ambition, risk, and a relentless drive to conquer the unknown. It all began with a gaze fixed on the horizon, where whispers of untold treasures and mysterious lands beckoned. For Britain, the sea was no longer just a barrier. It became a highway to destiny. Imagine the scene. Humble merchant ships, once used for simple trade, are refitted and transformed into vessels of exploration and conquest. On board are not just sailors, but explorers, soldiers, and settlers, all ready to gamble everything on a single voyage. The risks were immense. Violent storms could splinter their wooden ships in moments, and encounters with unknown cultures could erupt into fierce conflict. But the allure of what lay beyond was too strong to resist. Every ship that managed to return was a triumph. It brought back not just valuable cargo, but also something far more precious: knowledge. Maps of uncharted coastlines, stories of distant peoples, and samples of exotic goods. Each successful journey fanned the flames of ambition back home, reinforcing the dream of a powerful, sprawling empire. This wasn't just about adventure, it was about building a future. The first colonies established were more than just dots on a map. They were bold experiments. Think of them as laboratories for British influence. From the dusty trading posts in West Africa to the rugged, fledgling settlements in the Americas. These outposts were where the blueprint for an empire was drafted. It was here that British culture, commerce, and systems of governance began to merge with the local landscape. Life in these early settlements was anything but easy. Settlers battled against harsh climates they had never experienced, struggled with food and resource shortages, and often found themselves in tense standoffs with the indigenous populations whose land they now occupied. It was a brutal test of endurance. Yet, through sheer perseverance, they laid the foundational stones of what would become Britain's vast overseas network. Every single colony was a high-stakes gambler foothold that could either flourish into a center of global influence or collapse into failure from mismanagement or rebellion. At the very heart of this ambitious expansion was the Royal Navy. Britain's naval power was the engine driving the imperial machine. Mighty fleets patrolled the critical trade routes, acting as guardians for the vulnerable settlers and as a formidable challenge to rival European powers. And the competition was intense. Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands were all major players in the great game of colonization, each with their own claims and ambitions in these new territories. To succeed, Britain had to be smarter, more strategic, and more resilient than its rivals. This period was a steep learning curve. The young empire learned vital lessons in the arts of diplomacy and negotiation. But it also learned when to be pragmatic and, at times, ruthless. The very first seeds of British colonial administration were planted here. They developed tax systems, set up local councils, and introduced legal codes, creating a framework that would later be used to govern enormous territories across the world. But let's be clear, this conquest was never just about claiming land for the sake of it. The ultimate goals were to secure a steady flow of resources, establish lucrative trade monopolies that would enrich the nation and project British power and authority across the oceans. It was a grand strategy of economic and political domination. The initial interactions with local communities were complex and varied. It was a dynamic mix of cooperation, cultural exchange, and, inevitably, conflict. The English language, British customs, and new methods of commerce became powerful tools of influence, subtly and sometimes forcefully reshaping the societies they encountered. Britain's vision was becoming clearer with each passing year: a global network of colonies, all interconnected by trade, all protected by the world's most powerful navy, and all bound by allegiance to the crown. This is how the first crucial chapters of the British Empire were written. It was a story unfolding in bustling ports, precarious settlements, unfortified trading posts scattered across continents. The dream of an empire was no longer a far-off fantasy. It was taking tangible shape, built piece by piece, voyage by voyage. Every success, and indeed every failure, contributed to the nation's growing resilience, ingenuity, and a relentless ambition that was simply unmatched. This formative era forged the path for a period of unprecedented expansion, creating a global empire whose legacy, for better and for worse, continues to echo through our world today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the bell so you won't miss our next video. See you then. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Last time we witnessed Britain taking its first tentative steps onto the world stage. Today, we're diving into how those initial footholds transformed into a sprawling network of power, commerce, and influence. This is the story of how an island nation began to forge a global empire. The early British settlements weren't just dots on a map, they were seeds of ambition. What started as simple trading posts quickly blossomed into fortified towns. Ports that once welcomed a handful of explorers became bustling hubs of maritime trade, teeming with ships, sailors, and goods from every corner of the known world. The very nature of the voyages changed. No longer were they just for exploration. Now, ships carried soldiers to defend new territories, merchants to drive the engine of commerce, and administrators to lay the foundations of colonial rule. An intricate machinery of empire was being assembled piece by piece. Of course, governing these distant lands was a monumental challenge. Each colony presented a unique set of problems. Settlers grappled with unforgiving climates that tested the limits of human endurance. They faced strange and deadly diseases for which they had no immunity. And perhaps most complex of all, they had to navigate relationships with the indigenous peoples whose lands they were now claiming. This wasn't just about planting a flag, it was about survival and control. In this environment, diplomacy became just as crucial as military might. Treaties were signed, alliances were forged, and, let's be honest, deception was often used to tip the scales in Britain's favor. Colonial administrators had to become masters of political maneuvering, establishing systems of law, trade, and taxation that would become the very backbone of imperial control. But Britain wasn't the only player in this great game. Other European powers, especially the ambitious Spanish and the commercially savvy Dutch, watched Britain's expansion with growing alarm. They saw a direct threat to their own interests, and conflict was inevitable. The oceans became a battleground. Small skirmishes between ships could escalate in an instant. Rival powers launched raids on each other's trading posts. and fierce battles were fought for control of strategic islands and territories. These constant clashes taught the British a vital lesson. To build an empire, you must command the seas. This realization fueled the growth of the Royal Navy. It evolved from a modest defense force into the most sophisticated and powerful naval machine the world had ever seen. The Royal Navy became the ultimate guarantor of Britain's global ambitions. Protecting its vital trade routes, enforcing its authority in distant colonies, and projecting its power far from its home shores. However, it's a mistake to think that the empire's growth was built solely on conquest and military force. A much more subtle, yet equally powerful process was underway: a massive global exchange. As British ships crisscrossed the oceans, they carried more than just soldiers and gold. They carried ideas, cultures, and commodities. The demand for exotic goods like spices, sugar, and fine textiles from the East exploded in Europe, reshaping economies and tastes. In the colonies, a fascinating blend of local and European practices began to emerge, creating new, hybrid cultures. Britain's vision for its empire was evolving. It was no longer enough to simply claim land. True, lasting success depended on establishing a web of influence through commerce, effective administration, and, of course, undeniable naval dominance. The goal was to ensure that each colony, each port, each trading post became a self-sustaining and profitable pillar of a grand imperial structure. By the end of this transformative era, Britain was no longer just a maritime nation with a few overseas interests. It was emerging as a true global force. The lessons learned in the sweltering heat of Caribbean ports, the victories won, and the losses suffered on the high seas, and the immense challenges of governing diverse and distant territories all contributed to forging a new kind of empire. It was an empire that was resilient, adaptable, and relentlessly ambitious. The foundations had been laid, the machinery was in motion, and Britain was now poised to expand its influence even further, leaving a mark on the world that would be felt for centuries to come. What began as a series of risky ventures had become the dawn of a new global order, with Britain positioning itself right at the center. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the peak of imperial power and the challenges that came with it. See you next time. This is the story of how Britain, a small island nation, began its transformation into a global empire. Fueled by an insatiable hunger for trade and an iron will to defend it. As Britain's first colonies began to find their feet, a new age dawned, an age where the clinking of coins was as loud as the roar of cannons. Imagine merchant ships, their sails billowing in the wind, crossing treacherous oceans. They were filled with the treasures of the world: fragrant spices from the East Indies, sweet sugar, and rich tobacco from the Americas, and shimmering gold from the coasts of Africa. Each voyage was a gamble, a high-stakes adventure promising immense profit. But Britain wasn't alone in this global treasure hunt. Other European giants, Spain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, were all vying for the same prize. They understood a powerful truth: controlling trade meant controlling the world. Commerce wasn't just about getting rich, it was a weapon. The ability to dominate these lucrative sea lanes could make or break an empire. Suddenly, the world map became a chessboard, and every trade route was a critical square to control. This fierce competition inevitably spilled over into open conflict. The clash for global influence wasn't just fought on land anymore. It was won and lost on the waves. Naval battles erupted across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. These weren't just squabbles over remote islands. They were strategic moves to secure vital trade routes, protect supply lines that fed growing colonies, and cripple the economies of their rivals. Out of these fiery trials, the Royal Navy was forged. It grew from a modest fleet into the most formidable naval force the world had ever seen. British navigators became masters of the sea, charting unknown territories. perfecting naval tactics and demonstrating incredible endurance on long, arduous voyages. They learned to outthink and outfight their adversaries, ensuring that British merchant ships could sail with a degree of security. The Navy became the backbone of the empire, projecting Britain's power across vast distances and safeguarding its burgeoning commercial interests. Meanwhile, back in the colonies, something extraordinary was happening. These distant outposts were more than just sources of raw materials. They were becoming dynamic centers of British enterprise. Port cities like Boston, Kingston, and Calcutta boomed, their harbors bustling with ships from every corner of the known world. Local economies, once isolated, were now being woven into a complex global network, creating unprecedented wealth. These colonies were like laboratories, where new ideas about governance, law, and economics were tested and refined. But this prosperity was never guaranteed. Governing territories thousands of miles from London was an immense challenge. It required a delicate balance of diplomacy, adaptation, and, when necessary, military force. Resistance from indigenous peoples who saw their lands and ways of life threatened, along with constant scheming from rival European powers, tested Britain's resolve at every turn. These challenges taught crucial lessons in patience, negotiation, and the importance of strategic foresight. The empire was learning not just how to conquer, but how to rule. And this wasn't just a one-way street of extraction and control. The trade routes became conduits for a vast cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, foods, and languages flowed in both directions, influencing the colonizers as much as the colonized. The British learned about new crops and medicines, while they introduced their own systems of law, education, and administration. The empire was growing not just in size, but in complexity and sophistication. It was developing the very DNA of a long-lasting global power. Through all this, Britain's grand vision came into sharp focus. The goal was to command both trade and territory, to dominate the seas and the world's markets. They understood that commerce and power were two sides of the same imperial coin. One could not exist without the other. This relentless pursuit of wealth, secured by military might, became the defining characteristic of the rising British Empire. And so, this age of trade and conflict was the crucible that forged Britain's identity. Every naval skirmish won, every successful trading voyage completed, and every treaty shrewdly negotiated added another brick to the foundation of its global dominance. From these turbulent beginnings, an empire would rise, its influence stretching across continents, destined to reshape the political, economic, and cultural map of the world for centuries to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next video. Have you ever wondered how a small island nation managed to build an empire that stretched across the entire globe? It's a story of ambition, strategy, and a relentless drive for expansion that forever changed the world map. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain's aspirations had grown far beyond just setting up a few trading posts. They were thinking bigger. They were thinking continents. This wasn't just about planting a flag and moving on. It was a complex game of chess played on a global scale. The empire started to sink its roots deep into India, Africa, and other territories. But how did they do it? It was a masterful mix of diplomacy, commerce, and, when all else failed, military might. Imagine skilled negotiators making deals with local rulers one day and warships appearing on the horizon the next. This combination of a friendly handshake and a clenched fist became the hallmark of British expansion. Let's zoom in on India. This is where the story gets really interesting. The key player here wasn't the British government, at least not at first. It was a private corporation, the East India Company. This wasn't just any company. It was a powerhouse with its own army, its own navy, and its own political agenda. The company masterfully navigated the intricate web of local politics in India, which was a patchwork of powerful kingdoms and rival princes. They established forts that doubled as military bases, set up bustling trade centers that funneled wealth back to Britain, and slowly but surely built their own structures of governance. They weren't just trading spices and textiles anymore. They were ruling territories. This transformation from a commercial enterprise into a de facto government was one of the most remarkable and controversial chapters in imperial history. Now, let's shift our gaze to Africa. For centuries, the vast interior of the continent was a mystery to Europeans, often labeled the Dark Continent on maps. But as Britain's imperial ambitions grew, so did its curiosity. Explorers, missionaries, and traders pushed deeper into the heart of Africa, mapping its great rivers, discovering its rich resources, and connecting its diverse communities to a global network of trade. The coasts became dotted with British ports, and slowly, the interior regions were drawn into the orbit of the empire. This exploration wasn't just for the sake of adventure. It was about identifying resources, establishing trade routes, and securing strategic advantages over other European powers who were also scrambling for a piece of the African pie. But let's be clear, this expansion was never a simple walk in the park. It was met with fierce resistance every step of the way. Indigenous communities who had lived on their lands for generations did not simply stand aside. They fought back. Local rulers weren't just passive bystanders either. They were shrewd leaders who negotiated, formed alliances, or openly defied British authority. The very land itself presented enormous challenges. Navigating treacherous rivers, crossing vast deserts, and combating unfamiliar diseases tested the limits of British ingenuity and endurance. Supply lines were constantly stretched thin, and a single miscalculation could lead to disaster. So, how did Britain overcome these obstacles? They learned to adapt. They became masters of a strategy that blended negotiation with calculated shows of force. They understood the power of divide and rule, often playing local rivalries to their own advantage. They cultivated alliances with friendly rulers, promising them protection or wealth in exchange for loyalty. And when push came to shove, they relied on their superior military technology, disciplined armies, and a level of organization that their opponents often lacked. The empire became a kind of living laboratory for administration and control. And the lessons learned in one colony were often applied in another, creating a playbook for imperial rule that would be refined over centuries. The impact of this expansion was profound and multifaceted. As the British flag was raised in new territories, a wave of cultural and economic change followed. British architecture, with its grand government buildings and Victorian-style homes, began to appear in cities from Calcutta to Cape Town. British systems of law, education, and governance were introduced, often layered on top of existing local customs. This created fascinating and sometimes tense hybrid societies where old traditions met new ideas. The economic landscape was also dramatically reshaped. New economic models were imposed, designed to extract resources and create markets for British goods. While some port cities and settlements flourished under British oversight, becoming bustling hubs of commerce, many other communities faced hardship, disruption, and the loss of their traditional way of life. The story of imperial expansion is a complex one, filled with contradictions of progress and pain. The power of the British Empire was unjust measured by the amount of land it controlled on a map. Its true strength lay in its ability to influence societies, economies, and politics across vast distances. A global network of trade routes, protected by the unparalleled might of the Royal Navy, connected every corner of the empire. Raw materials from the colonies flowed into Britain's industrial factories, while manufactured goods flowed back out to colonial markets. This intricate system created a self-sustaining economic engine that fueled Britain's growth and solidified its position as the world's leading economic power. The empire began to function as a single, integrated global system with London at its very heart. By this point, the British Empire's reach was truly global. It had outposts, colonies, and spheres of influence in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Its identity as a global superpower was no longer in question. It was an undeniable fact. This massive expansion, however, created a paradox. The very territories that provided Britain with its strength and wealth also contained the seeds of its future challenges. The imposition of foreign rule stirred feelings of nationalism and a desire for independence among colonized peoples. The empire's vastness made it a target for rival powers, leading to a constant state of competition and conflict. And so, the stage was set for the next act in this epic drama. Britain had transformed itself from a maritime nation into a formidable global empire. Its influence spanned continents, and its ambitions seemed limitless. But with great power came great burdens. The promise of imperial glory was shadowed by the challenges of resistance, rivalry, and the immense difficulty of ruling over a quarter of the world's population. The story of the British Empire was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. And consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you next time. As the sun began its relentless journey across the vast British Empire, it wasn't just casting light on new territories. It was also revealing the deep cracks forming in the foundations of global dominance. The dream, so grand from the shores of Britain, was about to meet the harsh, unyielding reality of governance and resistance. This wasn't a simple story of conquest. It was the beginning of a complex, often brutal, struggle to hold on to power. Imagine being thousands of miles from home, in a land you now call a colony. You're living under the thumb of a foreign administration. Your life dictated by laws and taxes decided in a distant capital you've never seen. The goods you produce, the trade you conduct, are all controlled by monopolies that benefit a crown you have no allegiance to. This was the reality for millions, and it was a reality they were starting to reject. Far from being a passive tapestry of red on a map, the empire was a living, breathing entity, and it was getting restless. In the Americas, a unique tension was simmering. The settlers, many of whom had left Britain seeking freedom, found themselves chafing under the very same distant rule they thought they had escaped. They were British subjects, yes, but they were also developing a new identity. One that valued self-governance and resented being treated as a mere source of revenue for the mother country. The phrase "no taxation without representation" wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a deeply felt grievance that would eventually ignite a revolution. Meanwhile, across the vast expanses of India and Africa, the story of resistance was different, but the spirit was the same. Here, Britain wasn't just imposing taxes. It was encroaching on ancient cultures, disrupting age-old traditions, and seizing lands that had been held for generations. Local rulers, proud leaders of their communities, were not about to simply stand aside. They fought back, defending their autonomy, their heritage, and their very way of life. These weren't just skirmishes. They were fierce declarations that conquest did not equal consent. Each uprising, from the smallest village protest to large-scale rebellions, sent a clear message back to London. We are not yours to command. This put Britain in an incredibly precarious position. It was a constant, high-stakes balancing act. How do you assert your power without provoking a full-blown, uncontrollable war? How do you forge alliances with some local leaders while simultaneously suppressing the defiance of others? Sometimes in the very next valley, the Crown had to enforce its policies across immense oceans, with communication taking months and resources stretched impossibly thin. Every ship sent, every soldier deployed, every decree issued was a gamble. The consequences of a single miscalculation could be catastrophic, potentially losing a vital territory or sparking a conflict that could drain the treasury. And the treasury was already feeling the strain. The romantic image of empire building often hides the cold, hard numbers. Wars were ruinously expensive. Maintaining a global military and naval presence, the very muscle of the empire, was a logistical and financial nightmare. Think about it. Every fort, every garrison, every ship patrolling a distant sea required a constant flow of money, supplies, and manpower from a small island nation. The pressure was immense, not just on the colonies, but back home in the halls of Parliament. Out on the fringes of the empire, the governors and administrators were the ones on the front lines of this crisis. They were the men tasked with implementing London's grand plans. But they often had to do it with incomplete information and a profound lack of resources. Picture a governor in a remote corner of India receiving an order that makes no sense in the local context. Communication with London could take the better part of a year for a round trip. He couldn't just email for clarification. He had to improvise, to make life or death decisions based on his own judgment, his experience, and his intuition. These colonial leaders were part diplomat, part general, part bureaucrat, and part innovator, forced to create solutions on the fly to crises that London could barely comprehend. But it's in the crucible of challenge that resilience is forged. These constant tests forced the British establishment to evolve. They learned, often the hard way, that brute force wasn't always the answer. They began to understand the critical importance of flexibility, of knowing when to negotiate and when to stand firm. They started building sophisticated intelligence networks, realizing that information was a weapon just as powerful as a cannon. Understanding local politics, rivalries, and cultures became essential for survival and control. This period of turmoil led to a fundamental shift in how the empire was managed. Rudimentary systems of control gave way to more complex administrative structures. They developed methods to monitor dissent, to influence local economies, and to project power more effectively and, in their view, more efficiently. The very experience of fighting rebellions and navigating resistance honed the skills that would allow Britain to manage its vast, disparate territories with a greater degree of sophistication for another century and a half. So, these early revolts were more than just footnotes in history. They were the empire's first true test of character. The initial phase of conquest, fueled by ambition and technological superiority, had created a world of opportunity for Britain. But sustaining that empire, holding it together against the constant push of resistance and the internal pull of financial strain, demanded a completely different set of skills: patience, strategic foresight, adaptability, and an unwavering, often ruthless, determination. The way Britain responded to these first challenges would define the empire's identity for generations to come. It was a brutal education in the arts of governance, diplomacy, and the delicate, dangerous game of maintaining power across a world it was only just beginning to truly understand. The lessons learned in the jungles of Africa, the plains of India, and the forests of North America would echo through the corridors of power, shaping the rise and eventual fall of the largest empire in history. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the complexities of empire. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss our next exploration of history's biggest stories. See you next time. Hello, history enthusiasts, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating, often overlooked chapter of the British Empire, the monumental task of actually running the thing. It's one thing to claim a territory, but it's another entirely to manage a sprawling global empire, with its countless cultures, customs, and continents. How did Britain transform from a conqueror into a complex global administrator? Let's find out. Imagine being a colonial administrator in the 18th or 19th century. You're thousands of miles from home, tasked with governing a place completely alien to you. Your success doesn't just depend on orders from London. It hinges on your ability to navigate local politics, understand intricate social structures, and build relationships. This was the reality across the empire. Authority wasn't just imposed with a heavy hand. It had to be carefully negotiated. In many regions, local leaders, chiefs, and communities weren't passive subjects. They were active participants who engaged with Britain through alliances, trade agreements, and cultural exchange. This required immense diplomacy and adaptability from the British, who learned that cooperation was often far more effective than coercion. It was a steep learning curve, teaching them that to sustain growth, they needed to build systems that could respect the realities of distance and diversity. The challenges were immense, and they weren't just about putting down rebellions. Think about the logistics. How do you manage resources across an ocean? How do you ensure your instructions are followed when a message could take months to arrive? How do you integrate a newly acquired territory into a global economic network? These were the practical day-to-day problems that defined the era. The solutions were often found in refining the very machinery of governance. Britain began to establish sophisticated frameworks for administration, communication, and legal systems. These systems had to be a delicate balance, standardized enough to be efficient, but flexible enough to adapt to unique local conditions. It was a constant process of trial and error, of learning and evolving. Of course, none of this would have been possible without one crucial element: the Royal Navy. Britain's naval supremacy was the glue that held the empire together. Its fleets were more than just a military force. They were the guardians of the world's most critical trade routes. They ensured that goods, information, and people could move safely across vast oceans, connecting the farthest-flung colonies back to the heart of the empire in London. This secure network was the lifeblood of imperial trade, allowing resources to flow in and manufactured goods to flow out, creating an unprecedented global economy. The Navy didn't just project power, it projected stability, creating the conditions necessary for administration and commerce to thrive. Without this maritime dominance, the empire as a centralized, functioning entity simply could not have existed. As the empire matured, it moved beyond simple conquest and exploitation towards a more sophisticated model of stewardship, at least from its own perspective. Administrators weren't just soldiers or tax collectors. They became engineers, judges, and planners. They oversaw the construction of railways, telegraph lines, and ports. Infrastructure that not only served imperial interests, but also fundamentally reshaped the landscapes and economies of the colonies. This era saw the rise of a professional colonial service, men trained in law, engineering, and administration, sent out to govern with a manual and a mission. This institutional knowledge was key. Each challenge, whether it was a famine in India or a dispute over land in Africa, became a case study. The solutions and strategies developed were documented, shared, and refined, building a resilient and adaptive system of governance. This evolution wasn't a smooth or benevolent process, and it's crucial to remember the immense human cost and the perspectives of the colonized peoples. However, from a purely administrative standpoint, this period was transformative. The empire learned that enduring power wasn't just about military might. It was about building systems, managing complexity, and adapting to change. The challenges of governing a diverse, global empire forced Britain to innovate in law, technology, and administration. Each adjustment and innovation added another layer of resilience, creating a structure that was, for a time, capable of managing both immense opportunity and unprecedented complexity. By the end of this phase, the empire was more than just a collection of territories on a map. It was a complex, interconnected global system, ready to enter its final, most impactful stage. So, the British Empire grew not just in size, but in capability. It demonstrated that leadership, strategic planning, and the ability to manage complex systems were just as vital as the ambition that sparked its creation. It's this legacy of administration and infrastructure, for better or worse, that would leave one of the most enduring imprints on global history, shaping the modern world in ways we are still grappling with today. What do you think was the biggest challenge in governing such a vast empire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'll see you next time. Have you ever wondered how a small island nation managed to build one of the most extensive empires in history? It's a story of ambition, innovation, and a global network that reshaped the world. Let's journey back in time to understand the rise of the British Empire. It all started with exploration. Driven by a desire for new trade routes and resources, British sailors ventured into the unknown, charting coastlines and discovering lands far from home. These early voyages weren't just about adventure. They were the first threads in a vast web that would soon connect continents. Think of the ships setting sail from bustling ports like London and Bristol, carrying not just goods, but the ambitions of a nation. As these voyages became more frequent, trade became the empire's lifeblood. The British established trading posts in distant lands, from the Caribbean to India. These weren't just simple markets. They were strategic footholds that grew into centers of commerce and influence. The East India Company, for example, started as a trading venture but evolved into a powerful administrative force in its own right, demonstrating how commerce and governance often went hand in hand. To protect these valuable trade routes, Britain developed an unrivaled naval force. The Royal Navy became the guardian of the seas, ensuring that merchant ships could travel safely between Britain and its growing number of colonies. Control of the oceans was the key to holding the empire together. Imagine a global highway patrolled by the world's most powerful navy, ensuring a constant flow of goods, people, and information. This maritime dominance was the backbone of Britain's global power. With secure trade came settlement and administration. As more British citizens moved to the colonies, they brought with them their systems of law, government, and education. This process created a complex network of governance that spanned the globe. Each colony, while unique, was connected to a centralized system that managed everything from local administration to defense. This organizational skill was remarkable. It was like managing a global corporation with the technology of the 18th and 19th centuries. The empire wasn't just a political or economic entity, it was a vast network of cultural exchange. While the flow of influence was often one-sided, the connections established led to a blending of ideas, languages, and traditions. Cities like Hong Kong, Mumbai, and Singapore became cosmopolitan hubs where different cultures met and mingled. The English language spread across the globe, becoming a common tongue for commerce and diplomacy, a legacy that endures to this day. The Industrial Revolution in Britain supercharged this expansion. New technologies in manufacturing, transportation, and communication made it easier to manage and profit from the empire. Steamships could travel faster and more reliably than sailing vessels, and the telegraph allowed for near-instantaneous communication across vast distances. It was a technological leap that shrank the world and tightened Britain's grip on its territories. Of course, this story of expansion is not without its complexities and controversies. The impact on local populations, the exploitation of resources, and the imposition of foreign rule are crucial parts of this history that deserve their own deep exploration. The legacy of the empire is a subject of ongoing debate, and it's important to look at it from all perspectives. But focusing on the mechanics of its rise, the British Empire was a masterclass in organization and logistics. It was built on a foundation of maritime power, commercial drive, and administrative structure. The ability to connect and manage territories across different continents, cultures, and climates was an unprecedented achievement in human history. This intricate system created a globalized world long before the term became common. Goods from India could be found in London, while British laws were being implemented in Australia. This interconnectivity laid the groundwork for many of the global systems we see today, from international trade laws to financial networks. The City of London, for example, became the world's financial capital, a role it maintains to this day, thanks to the networks established during the Imperial era. As we look back, we can see the empire as a testament to strategic vision and relentless determination. It was a system that relied on the coordination of countless individual sailors, traders, soldiers, and administrators, all working within a framework that directed their efforts towards a common goal of expansion and control. The establishment of ports, the building of railways, and the creation of administrative bodies were all pieces of a giant puzzle, carefully assembled over centuries. The story of the British Empire's rise is a powerful lesson in how vision, combined with strategic organization and technological advantage, can shape the course of history. It demonstrates how a small nation, through perseverance and forward thinking, was able to project its influence across the globe, creating a legacy that continues to be felt in our modern, interconnected world. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. If you found this exploration interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. And subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.